Hello everyone and welcome back to Rick's Garage. Are you tired of your bike's front suspension leaking every forking time you take it out? Well, stay tuned because today I'm going to show you how to fix that problem.
Say hello to the bad side. My emotion is flatline. Hungry demon, what I'm seeing is snack time. When I rush in the grab, I better run from the path line.
Almost all modern motorcycles use some kind of hydraulically dampened telescopic forks, but this wasn't always the case. The earliest steel horses used a series of rods and girders to create a linkage design. Now these were adequate for the time, but with advancements in engine and braking systems, there was a growing need for new suspension tech as well. It was in the 1930s where the biggest advancement was introduced. Likely based from aircraft landing gear, in 1935 BMW released the world's first hydraulic telescoping front forks. Now, as big of a leap as it was, telescoping forks actually didn't take off in popularity until well after World War II, and even then the earliest designs received a lot of criticism. Enter the 1960s and 70s, where the most common fork design was the damper rod system. That's the same kind of fork outfitted on QuaranTina, and that's what we're working on today. Let's head over to the bench and take a closer look. So the way this all works starts with the fork tube or stanchion. This is attached to the bike's frame with the help of the triple clamps. The damper rod fits inside the hollow fork tube and sticks out the bottom. The fork spring also goes in the tube and sits on top of the damper rod. It's held in place with a steel cap and retaining ring that seals the fork tube and also keeps spring tension on the rod. The bottom of the damper rod is bolted to the fork slider, which fits over the lower half of the fork tube and attaches the front axle and wheel. The fork spring inside the stanchion supports the weight of the bike and rider, but on its own it doesn't do very well over bumps. The compression of the forks charges the spring with energy, and normally the rebound motion would continue until the spring eventually expends all of that energy. Now this is where the damper rod comes in. The fork slider has a certain level of oil in it, and it's forced up the middle of the damper rod into the stanchion through a small hole in the side. This restriction of fluid flow resists the up and down movement of the fork tube, creating a shock absorber similar to what you'd find on your car or truck. Now, the two most common failures of this style of forks is the oil changing its viscosity with age or contamination, or a leak somewhere, most commonly the seal between the fork tube and slider. Either of those problems will cause the forks to perform poorly. You may experience a loose, bouncy ride or even excessive dive where the nose of the bike dips as you apply the brakes. While it's tough to tell the condition of the oil without changing it, leaks are generally easy to spot. Usually you'll find a line on the fork tube where the slider bottoms out, and below that line will be covered in oil. Remember, if the seal is bad enough to let oil out, then it'll usually allow air and dirt in, contaminating the system. Now that you're familiar with what you're looking for, let's get the bike on the stand and get started. If you need details on how the brakes come off, check out episode 31, but once they're out of the way, the front wheel comes off by removing the axle nut on the right side and loosening the two nuts on the bottom of the left fork. Then loosen the bolts in the triple tree and slide the forks out. The first step on the bench is removing the bolt attaching the damper rod to the inside of the fork slider. Just make sure to soften the jaws of your vise. The sliders are made out of aluminum and they gouge very easily. Since there's still spring tension on top of the damper rod, it prevents it from spinning, making the job a lot easier. Make sure you're wearing gloves and have lots of rags handy. This part has the potential to get pretty messy. To speed up the draining process, you can remove the screw on the side of the slider. On the top of the fork, the plastic plug gets removed, which will expose the steel cap. To access the retaining ring, you'll need to press down on the cap, compressing the fork spring inside. I find the easiest way to do this is with a Robertson screwdriver that centers itself on the cap. With your free hand, use a small pick or screwdriver to pop the ring out of its groove. Then you can gently release the spring tension, which will usually pop the cap out of the fork tube. Now, depending on the age and condition of your bike, you may have some corrosion sticking the cap in place. A couple of gentle raps on the outside of the tube should shake everything loose, and make sure to clean off the edges of the cap and inspect the O-ring once it's out. Next, slide the fork spring out of the tube and set it aside on a towel. With it out of the way, you can pour whatever's left in the tube into the oil container. The outer dust seal pops off the top of the slider, and since the damper rod bolt has already been removed, the fork tube and rod can come out of the slider. So here's the seal that's been causing problems. Its retaining ring sits in a groove and can come out easily with a small screwdriver. Now, if you don't have a seal puller, like me, you can gently use a flathead to pry underneath it. Just be very careful not to scrape the inside walls of the slider. If you leave gouge marks with the screwdriver, there's a very good chance it'll leak once you put it all back together. With everything torn down, it gives me the perfect opportunity to improve the appearance of those neglected fork sliders. I started with a nylon wheel on my drill to get rid of any corrosion and to strip the thin layer of oxide on the surface of the aluminum. I was also able to remove some gouges and casting marks with a file. Be very careful if you attempt this part yourself. As I mentioned, aluminum is very soft metal and it's easy to get carried away. To smooth out the heavier scratches left by the nylon wheel, I used some green Scotch-Brite and then it was over to the buffing wheel. This is a 6-inch spiral sewn wheel and I'm using some brown Tripoli polish. Even after a little bit of buffing, you can see what kind of difference the polish makes already. Now, I'm not going for a mirror finish, but if that's your thing, remember to avoid using different types of polish on the same wheel. You're going to need a dedicated wheel for each polishing compound you're planning on using. A bit of elbow grease really brings up the appearance of the fork slider, so now that the hard work is done, let's get the new oil seal in place and take a look at the reassembly. The new oil seal should be a very tight fit. Dab some sealant around the outside of the rubber, which will act as a lubricant while it's fresh, and once it's cured, if you happen to scrape the slider a bit removing the old seal, it will help fill in any small nicks or gouges. Using a large diameter socket will help drive the seal into place evenly, and once it's bottomed out, reinstall the retaining clip. Be sure to use a little bit of oil on the seal so it doesn't tear when fitting the fork tube and damper rod assembly. Make sure it's bottomed out and use the spring to hold the damper rod in place to reinstall that lower bolt. Check your manual to find out what type and how much oil your specific fork takes, and when the fork tube cap is back in place, this leg of the fork is ready to be reinstalled on the bike. Whew, that was a lot of forking work. Now, it was pretty obvious that QuaranTina's forks needed some serious attention, but something like an oil seal change is just part of regular repair and maintenance. At least now, with some fresh oil and making sure it stays inside the fork, the front end should operate just as it should. I hope you found this video helpful, and if so, drop a like, and if you want to see what's left before it's time to take this death trap for a ride, subscribe with notifications so you'll never miss any new content. I'm Rick the Welder, and as always, thank you all very much for watching.